Welcome to the Valley Today, a public service presentation of KAIL-TV. Today we'll visit with Dr. Cassandra Joubert, member of BWOPA, Black Women Organized for Political Action. BWOPA is a nonprofit founded to promote black women into local and state politics. Dr. Cassandra Joubert and BWOPA, up next on the Valley Today. Welcome to the Valley Today. We are with Cassandra Joubert, Dr. Cassandra Joubert, and what are you, Doctor of?
Doctor of Public Health.
Doctor of Public Health, and you work for Fresno State.
That's correct.
And the reason that we are here today together is because you sent me a letter from BWOPA, which is the Black Women Organized for Political Action. And if I could just read a few sentences from this letter. We are writing to call to your attention to an issue of great importance to our organization. Black Women Organized for Political Action is a statewide 501c4 nonprofit advocacy and membership organization. Founded in 1968, BWOPA's primary goal is to educate, train, and involve as many African American women,
yes,
she wanted me to stress women, as possible in the political process at the local and state levels. As an organization concerned about contemporary political matters, BWOPA's members are constantly viewing the local and national news broadcasts throughout the Central Valley. African Americans play a significant role in business community affairs as well as local state governmental operations. However, as we view your news broadcasts, we find that there are no African American on-air news personalities represented.
And
well, we do have an African-American news personality on our station, Terrence Kendricks. And,
excellent.
And he's done a good job for us over the years. He does community bulletin boards, and he's actually on the air more than anybody else at the station.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a good thing.
It is.
We're very we're happy to see African American males. Thrilled to see African American males in these positions. Mm-hmm. Our organization focuses primarily on women, but unlike some political organizations that have women as a focus, we also promote and advocate for African American men in these roles as well.
Well, you're advocating for African Americans.
Absolutely.
In
That's
general.
correct.
Right.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And historically, women, if you look at our Congress, at our state assembly, et cetera, women are underrepresented. Right. So this is a good reason to promote more women involved in the political process. But from the African American community perspective, we realize that as a whole, African Americans are underrepresented. So we're very happy to see males in these positions as well.
And you had some interesting statistics here. There's only 5% African Americans in Fresno County.
That's right, in Fresno County.
Fresno County.
That's correct. And pretty much throughout the valley, those numbers are about the same. Unlike the major urban centers like LA or Oakland or San Francisco, Right. So the valley's a bit different. And often the numbers, the fact that we don't have as many African Americans, really results in African Americans being more invisible in the political process and the media, but the problems facing our community are really pretty severe on a number of levels. And what BWOPA is, BWOPA is concerned about are issues around health, education, criminal justice, and economics. Those are our 4 core issues that every year we have a visit to the state capitol for our Legislative Learning Day. This year it's in May.
May 30th.
May 30th of this year. We go up and we talk to our representatives about these issues, about our concerns about in the health area, for example, concerned about African Americans not having access to quality health care to address many severe health problems like asthma, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, stroke. And so our mortality rates are much higher than the general population for those health issues.
How did BWOPA get started?
Well, it started back in 1968 in the Bay Area, actually around the time that Congressman Ron Dellums was running for Congress, and some local female activists got together to support that campaign. And you know, in the 60s, there were a lot of interesting and powerful social movements going on in terms of social justice, getting people to vote, getting people elected, etc. And that's really how BWOPA got started.
Yeah.
And then over the years, the organization ended up supporting local people, city council folks. Our state president, Dr. Desi Woods Jones, was on the Oakland City Council. And there have been many people over the years that we've supported. Many BWOPA members, like Attorney General Kamala Harris, Holly Mitchell.
Oh, Kamala Harris is a
yes,
BWOPA member.
yes,
No kidding.
yes. So we have some very prominent women who've been involved with BWOPA over the years, Maxine Waters and Karen Bass, and so these women are legacies in their own right. And now we're really concerned about bringing up young people to fill
next
those shoes.
generation, right.
Absolutely, to fill those shoes.
Yeah. And this organization, has it affected change?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, when we endorse a candidate, for example, that's taken very seriously. I mean, we have the pull because of our history and because of our success and because of the quality of women that we've had involved in our organization, as well as their commitment and expertise in really promoting and addressing some of the issues that particularly are important in the Black community.
Right.
So when you have the BWOPA support behind you, it's been important. It's been valuable for getting people elected.
And certainly one of the big issues is the boys and men of color.
Absolutely.
And the difference in them being institutionalized.
Yes.
Or put in prison.
I tell you, Bob, it's there are health disparities for boys and men of color. There are educational disparities in terms of high school completion, college matriculation, academic achievement overall. There's the minority achievement gap that we talk about locally, both in with Latino boys as well as African American boys. And then there are certainly socioeconomic issues around employment and being able to make a living wage. And then there are the issues around criminal justice, the disproportionate incarceration of African American boys and men, which really is a symptom of many of the problems around health, access to good health care, access to quality education. They sort of, if you will, mushroom at the top with then involvement in the criminal justice system.
Is it cultural or is it prejudice?
Well,
or is it both?
I think, Bob, that there are what we call structural barriers that different communities experience, structural barriers to support. Okay, so for example, the fact that our schools in poor communities are under-resourced, that's an issue. That's an issue that has to do with federal policy and financing of schools.
But isn't, like, for instance, in the Fresno Unified School District, isn't the monies spread throughout? Isn't it all proportional?
Yes, in the sense of within that district, yes. But, you know, the way schools are funded has to do with property taxes, right? And so if in more affluent communities, those schools have more resources than in others.
Higher property taxes.
Absolutely.
And they pour more into their local schools.
So school finance reform is a big issue when you talk about leveling the playing field for kids of color. Now, you know, I think that another clear structural issue in this country is racism. Whether we want to talk about that or not, there are carryovers from years and years of legislatively promoted racist policies that have kept people.
For instance, give me one.
Well, the Jim Crow laws.
Okay.
You know, if you look back and you know, the old separate but equal kind of philosophy, which we always knew.
Fountains, 2 different restrooms, the whole thing.
But we always knew that separate couldn't be equal.
No.
Because by definition, the resources that
Was that the South's way of getting back at the North for winning the Civil War?
Well, I don't know.
The white man's South. Excuse me.
Right. Well, Bob, I'm not an expert on that, so I don't want to go down a road that I'm not. But I am a Southerner,
Right.
and so I grew up in those
Where'd you grow
races.
up?
I grew up in Houston, Texas,
Oh, okay.
in segregated Houston. My father was a mailman, and the access to employment for black men in those days was pretty much limited to the post office, manufacturing jobs. Certainly, college education was not available or accessible for most black men.
So perhaps nothing has really changed in the black community, but maybe even gotten worse.
Well, I think what has happened, and a lot of sociologists write about this, is that there is more concentrated poverty in the United States now, and actually residential segregation is on the rise.
Because of economics.
Because in part of economics,
Right.
yes, and because of economic and workforce policies that have taken jobs to affluent communities, and that become a barrier for people who are kind of concentrated and locked into urban centers,
Right.
don't have access to. That coupled with education, the globalization of the economy and the need for really high-skilled workers, right? So here you have, in our country, the disproportionate funding of schools, which means that the quality education is different for
Right.
different populations. Then you have to have resources, to go to college. You have this backlash against affirmative action, which we saw 10 years ago. I went to graduate school on a fellowship. I went to undergraduate school on a fellowship. I wouldn't be sitting here today on my father's mailman salary if
Well, I have an interesting comment about affirmative action, but I don't think it's germane to this conversation.
Well, we are happy to talk to you offline about that, but
Yeah.
the truth is that the college matriculation rates for African Americans has declined consistent with the lack of available fellowships, scholarships, et cetera. And, the cost of college education, of course, is an issue for everybody, independent of race and ethnicity today. But I'm just saying that when you have a history in this nation of excluding African Americans systematically through policy, and then you lay on top of that economic disparities and disincentives, lack of access to Pell Grants and that sort of thing, well, that's what, back to your point of things are getting worse, well, this is the result of those faulty policies
Right.
over many, many years.
One thing that I know about the black community is that the women have held it together because of the lack of, the fathers in the household, and the women have done everything. They've been working, they're raising children, they've kept it all together. And that
Yes.
really has changed the culture, hasn't it?
Well, there's a lot of debate about what came first, the chicken or the egg sort
Yeah.
of thing, whether or not women have had to step up and do what they could do. When my grandmother my grandmother was a domestic worker. She could get a job when my grandfather couldn't.
Right.
Okay, so
She was more employable.
she was more employable
Yeah.
because, again, of that system that set in place access to certain jobs and education that others didn't have. So it's a question of, are we really truly a matriarchal society? Or
They
have
were
women
been forced
exactly?
into it.
And then if you look at welfare policy, if you look at who becomes eligible for family supports based on income, it's usually women with children.
Right.
Okay, so social policy actually fostered the split, if you will, in terms of role and responsibility, because women could get the food stamps and the social supports because they had a child to take care of. Men didn't qualify for any of those supports. So over time, you have more and more men who are less able to provide for their families, and women who can only provide for their families.
And not only that, but they were forced out.
Yeah.
The men were forced out.
It was a push out.
Yeah.
It was definitely, and we see the same kind of push out policies even today in schools. This is why policy is so important, Bob. People want to look at culture and whether or not, the families are dysfunctional and what's their work ethic and all of that. All of what we're seeing today is a result of faulty policy, that when you set up systems that disenfranchise men, when you set up systems that disenfranchise African Americans or Latinos, then these are the results that will happen.
Right.
And the easy answer is blame the victim. It's their culture and they really don't believe. Well, I had an employer once say to me, why she asked me why I got divorced. I was married for 17 years and I got divorced, and she said, well, is why you got divorced is that your husband didn't have a strong work ethic. And I thought to her, I thought to myself, this is a stereotype about African American families. My husband worked for Ford Motor Company for 30 years. Okay, most of the men in my world started working when they were 12 and 13 years old.
Right.
So, and how can you talk about work ethic when African Americans built this economy in this nation on their backs?
Absolutely.
On plantations?
Right.
How can you talk about that? How can you talk about work ethic for Latinos when they're out working the fields and feeding the nation? So our culture comes up with these reasons to justify their beliefs that are inaccurate about subgroups and to justify the policies that make some people rich and make other people suffer.
Yeah.
So we could talk about that for a long time, couldn't we?
We're out of time on this. We're with Dr. Cassandra Joubert, and we're talking about the BWOPA and the disparity with African Americans. And we'll be right back right after this brief message. Welcome back to the Valley. Today we're with Dr. Cassandra Joubert, and we are talking about the disparity between the different cultures.
Yes.
And the BWOPA, which is the Black Women Organized for Political Action, the question that I just asked you before we started this segment again was, are you going out into the local communities or this local community and going into a really poor neighborhood and finding children that you can mentor?
Well, we are not a service organization in that way. Our individual members, of course, volunteer and do any number of wonderful service projects, but our focus as an organization is really on getting women involved in the political process. So what we do is we try to identify young women, like at Fresno State, young women who are interested in becoming elected officials. We provide training, how to run for office 101.
I have never heard of BWOPA before.
Well, there you have it.
And I'm glad that I've been able to get dialed in and learn a little bit about that.
Well, when I came to Fresno 3 years ago, I came from Detroit. So I'm accustomed to living in a community where there's a strong African American presence. Mm-hmm. And here I just happened to notice that the numbers are very small, 5% of the population. And so the social outlets, the connections for me were pretty limited. And I was very fortunate to meet a local woman, Gwen Morris. I don't know if you know Gwen. She used to be with One by One Leadership. Now she's with the 93706 Council. But Gwen was one of the people who told me about BWOPA and got me involved. Now I'm the local president of the chapter. Thank you, Gwen. But
your plate's full.
Yeah, my plate's pretty full. But it provides a network for women who are concerned about their communities and who are keeping a watchful eye on policy and politics.
Yeah.
And want to make some change.
Right. And so, what is the biggest issue with black women in this day and age?
Well, that's a hard one,
family?
Bob. I would have to say that one of the biggest issues is the disproportionate incarceration of black men, because when you remove men from their homes and their communities, the community as a whole suffers.
Right.
So you're talking about economic impacts that has on families. You talk about grief and loss that kids feel when they don't know their fathers, or they don't have access to their fathers. I would say that's probably, not to speak of the injustice of being incarcerated for maybe a minor drug offense and having to leave your family behind. I would probably say that is one of the biggest issues, and I think that is why the Trayvon Martin case got such publicity, is because not only are men being pushed out of our communities into prison, but they're being murdered, and no one seems to care about that.
Right.
Another case, I can't remember the gentleman's name, 68 or so year old military retiree that who accidentally set off his life monitor one night, and the police were notified. They came to the home to respond supposedly to the fact that his monitor had gone off, and this was a health-related monitor of some kind, and they ended up killing him. So we have to ask questions like, well, why do these things happen in America? Why are black men all of a sudden, because they were pulled over, they end up dead? Because police respond, they end up dead. Because they walk through a neighborhood with a hoodie, they end up dead.
Yeah.
So I would say that's the biggest crisis for us, is our men.
How many black men and young men are incarcerated in California? Do you know?
I don't know the number, but I do know that
It's the highest culture incarcerated.
The
right?
incarceration rates are highest.
Over 50%.
I think the data you were looking at is Fresno County,
Yeah.
and we were looking at incarceration rates for juveniles in particular, and the rate per 1,000 was something like 56 youth per 1,000 are being incarcerated in Fresno County, compared to, I think it was about 18 per 1,000 for Latinos, and much small, single digits for whites.
Yeah, single digit for whites.
Right. So these are issues that really call for major involvement and voice in the political process.
Yeah. What are the answers? What are the answers?
Well,
racism is still prevalent.
Racism
Prejudice is still prevalent?
is alive and well. But I think it's just like when you look back at the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Act. You look at the change in Jim Crow laws. Change happens through changes in policy.
Right.
You may not like me, Bob, because I'm black, but it really doesn't really affect me. You can not like me and that be okay. We can work in the same work environment and that be okay. We don't have to like each other to work together. But where my life gets impacted adversely is when a policy, a bill of some kind, is put forth that really impacts my ability to care for my family, to make a livable wage, to have great quality education for my kids, to have access to health care. That's where my life is affected, and that's what BWOPA is concerned about.
Yeah. And also, BWOPA is an advocate for men, not
Absolutely.
only for women, but
That's right.
it's an advocate for men through making women more savvy, making black women more savvy.
Well, we all have a lot to learn about the political process and
Right.
how bills become law, how to influence policy when different issues are being taken on, and we have a responsibility. We had a wonderful speaker at our meeting last night from the Madera NAACP. Mm-hmm. Her name is Gloria Brown, and she's head of the NAACP there, and she was talking about how she got involved in politics, which, she talked about the injustices that her ancestors had experienced over the years, and how that has spurred her in terms of getting people out to vote, becoming involved in political issues. And I think that most African Americans have some story like that. I know I certainly do. I was a victim of a hate crime as a 9-year-old. My father, as a mailman walking through neighborhoods in segregated Houston, had eggs and tomatoes thrown at him and N-words.
Because he was black.
Sure. So, those kinds of things are part of our lived history that then make us really, really concerned about justice for everybody.